On behalf of Crossroads Cultural Center, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's event, Q&A with Eve Tushnet. It's a pleasure to have Ms. Tushnet with us as our speaker. Before I begin, I just want to say a little bit about her biography, where she's from and what she's done. She lives in Washington, D.C. and was raised somewhere between atheism and Reform Judaism. In fact, one of the more interesting things I read is that around 13 or 14 years old, she came out to her family and proceeded to go to college a happy lesbian in her freshman year. By the end of her sophomore year at 19 years old, had converted to Catholicism. And this has been, for most who have encountered her writings, the primary fascination. We have a little bit of a different take maybe tonight. But she entered the church in 1998, and since then has been a prolific writer, both for internet-based blogs and for major periodicals, and even her own biography and then some fiction. She has been profiled in the New York Times Beliefs column. She blogs regularly at the American Conservative and at Pathos, and her work has been published in the Atlantic, Weekly Standard, Commonweal, and First Things. She's written for the Washington Post's On Faith blog and the New York Times Room for Debate. She's the author of Gay and Catholic, Accepting My Sexuality, Finding Community, Living My Faith, and a novel called Amends. So many of you know her from her work as a writer and a commentator, but many of us have also been struck by her witness of faith. What is most striking in her story is the disarming honesty of her experience and the purity of her desire to embrace the true, the good, and the beautiful. It is not too hard to find intellectually gifted people who find the richness of the Catholic tradition a playground for their intelligence and aesthetic sense. It is much more rare to find a highly intelligent person who is able to recognize that Christianity is in its core a carnal, human experience, not just a set of intellectual propositions or a list of ethical precepts. In fact, recognizing the concrete, visceral nature of Christianity demands from that type of person the greatest sacrifice. To accept what is most worth loving will always exceed our ability to understand it. Eve writes, I definitely feel that the church is the place where I need to be because of the Eucharist. That's what initially made me sure I would need to become Catholic. Its vividness, its visceral quality. The fact that God would do this really emphasizes the importance of our bodies and the importance of the physical world. And also it's very lurid and scandalous to people today, just as it first scandalized people when Jesus told them what he was going to do. And I think there is something in that kind of shocking, fleshly, and even materially violent aspect of the Eucharist that responds to the world as we find it, which is shocking and violent and lurid. I feel like any religion that made it easier to understand or abstract away from that violence would be hard to believe. I ask you to welcome Eve Tushnet. So the format will be a Q&A. I'll start it off with a few questions and then open up the floor. But I wanted to begin, Eve, a little bit with that experience of the difference, right? How does someone raised between atheism and Judaism, and those views about Christianity and especially the church, how did that change? What was the difference after your conversion in the way that you viewed these things, right? Which is probably dramatic enough. But also, especially that aspect which emphasizes the carnal, lurid, and scandalous nature.
Yeah, so I think that before I became Catholic and before I encountered Catholics who were really interested in sharing their faith with me, I had a kind of contradictory view of, or I had sort of two views of Catholicism at the same time. One was a pretty standard progressive, the church is oppressive and hates women and is out to make sure that nobody has any fun ever, and is in denial about the beauty and reality of the body. I probably would have said it in almost those words because I was a very pretentious high schooler. But then on the other hand, I was also pretty artsy and had read enough to get some sense, and had sort of looked into the arts enough to get some sense that there is so much beautiful artwork coming from the church and flowing from the faith of artists. Or not even necessarily their own personal faith, but an attempt to represent what Christianity is. That was incredibly powerful to me. Caravaggio has been one of my favorite artists for a long time, from before I became Catholic. And I now, I didn't talk about this in the book, but sort of weirdly, I realized a while ago that when I was in high school and was going to protests, where we chant, keep your rosaries off my ovaries and that kind of thing. At the same time, I was writing these short stories so there was one that was actually called The Church is the Body, that was my attempt to sort of explore what does it mean that our bodies are simultaneously beautiful and sort of something to be honored, and at the same time sort of broken and sickly. So I had this story about a very sick woman who was working in a very manually grueling profession, who was rejected by her church because she was sick, basically. If you have guessed from this that I was really bad at phys ed and still resent having to do it, that's absolutely what's coming out in the story. But it was basically, I was sort of trying to come up with this, what if there were a way to, I guess in a certain way I was posing this false dichotomy of morality and judgment on the side of the church, and then both aesthetic power and weakness in the body of this woman. And so I gave it to my Spanish teacher, who was Cuban. I don't know what her actual belief was, but I would guess just from her background that she at least had more experience of Catholicism than I did. And she sort of reasoned, she's like, it's sort of interesting. I don't think you were going for this at all, but it's a very Christian story. I was sort of taken aback. And then later, ended up writing a very bad story that I never finished. It was actually worse than that one, that I never finished. That was all about reliquaries and how extraordinary it is that you would, and how kind of mysteriously compelling it is that there are these things that are just beautiful things to put bones in. These things which one might throw out or in some way want to get rid of, view as garbage, but instead because they were part of a human body once, they still carry some of that life and power, and therefore need to be honored with beauty. And again, I think I probably thought of that as in some way tweaking the Catholic Church, or being look, I've taken your reliquaries. When in fact, sort of obviously, it's coming from a position of being fascinated by reliquaries, and thinking that the attitude toward the body that they display was, and the reverence toward the human body that they display. The saints are not reducible to their actions or their wills or their holiness, but the body of the saint continues to be important. Fairly obvious that was sort of fascinating to me in a way that I was really drawn to. So I guess one way of telling the story is that I began to see that the Catholic Church was the reliquaries, right? That it was more that, or not more even, that the side that, how to put it? I guess that the same Catholic Church that produced all of this art and all of this music and all of this sort of glamorous, almost darkly fascinating beauty was also the same side that would be able to see Jesus, to see God in the marginalized, the suffering, the sick, the weak, the people who are not good at phys ed, and honor that as well, and to see that too as sort of the center of the universe. So I guess, I will say though that when I converted, I was very, very naive, and probably definitely too intellectual and sort of rationalist, and if you just tell me what to do, I'll do it and that'll be fine. And a lot of the time since then has been spent kind of like realizing that you can't actually just give people, that your faith, right, is not a list of rules, that the Catholic faith is not even the Catechism, which is itself more than a list of rules, but that it's not this sort of intellectual proposition, but an entering into sort of a liturgical experience of the world and encounter with God. That was really rambling, but there we go.
No, but you said something that I think is, that for me was really interesting, a lot of things, but you speak about the art, and then you speak about the relics. And in a way that is kind of strange, right, because I was also bad at PE, obviously. I have a very similar experience to you as a kid, not from the perspective of trying to destroy the church, but from the fascination that I had at the same age, and we're born the same year, so we're doing this at the same time, with the fascination with the relics and with the art. And so one of the questions I have is, so that attracted you, how do those two things, an emphasis on art and beauty, and then an emphasis on the carnality, which is like very clear with the relics, right? You see, I remember the first time I saw bones of a saint in a coffin, right, with a wax figure over it and the whole thing. There's something so absolutely physical, and yet at first it attracts you. How does that sustain faith for you, or does it? Does it have a way that it, how does it transmit to you to this liturgical experience that you speak at the end?
Yeah, I think that there were, how to put, part of it is just that you do a lot of stuff with your body, right, as part of Catholic worship. Different churches, the Eastern Rite churches do this differently, but for me, I think all the kneeling is really, really powerful. Just the kind of physical motions and the fact that your body and not just your mind has to be involved in your worship, both in terms of receiving the Eucharist, but also even around that, the crossing oneself, all the standing and sitting and standing and sitting and kneeling. Inherently, I think, helps you to kind of be a whole person, right? There's a certain integrity in worshiping, not only with your voice and with your mind and your thoughts and your will, but also with your body, that it sort of knits them all together. Yeah, I don't talk more because I'm not sure that I'm...
No, so I can put it another way. One of the themes that you explore a lot in your writing is the need to offer yourself, right? To have that experience of sacrificial love, and that this kind of has shifted from kind of the attraction to the idea of the church to like a real personal question: how do I live out love? And that seems to me something entirely physical, because you don't love with your mind, right? You love with where you stand, with what you are. And one of those aspects for you has been the work that you do at crisis pregnancy centers. It seems to me that that's another aspect that sustains you, right? Actually, not just like being committed to the pro-life cause, but giving your time and your life to these women, giving your flesh in a certain sense. Can you speak a little bit about that experience, the carnality of that kind of thing, and what that means for you as a person, as a Catholic, as a woman, as a person who is experiencing all of these things in her faith?
Yeah. Do I need this? Does it work if I just talk?
Probably does.
Okay. I think one of kind of the harder questions for me in figuring out, so I guess put it this way, a big chunk of Gay and Catholic is not my personal story. It starts with my personal story, just to give you a sense of where I'm coming from, but the bulk of the book is taken up with trying to map out what are some ways that gay or same-sex attracted Catholics can give and receive love within the church. And in doing that, if you ask the question that way, you uncover all of these sort of historical examples of devoted, honored love outside of marriage and even outside of religious vocations. So you discover friendship as a form of kinship, you discover godparenthood and the ways in which that has been used to make family in the church. and that there are all of these relationships which are now publicly not recognized at all. You're not going to be like putting your child's godparent on your health insurance, for example. And yet these were at one point publicly recognized and acknowledged and honored ways of loving and devoting yourself to and caring for other people. And a lot of them take, the more that they are important in society, the more they can structure your life, the more they take on physical markers, the more physically affectionate they become, the more they are incorporated into the life of the church. So obviously with godparenthood, it's incorporated into, or I guess around the edges of the sacrament of baptism. With friendship, there are some really beautiful ceremonies where, for example, two friends might stand on the steps of the church and pledge to share their lives with one another and care for one another's children. Having made this pledge to do life together, to share a household, they go into the church, they hear Mass together, exchange the kiss of peace, receive the Eucharist together. So in that way, they are not only, they're both part of the body of Christ, but they're sort of emphasizing that we are that this bond in the Eucharist is what unites us, and that we are willing to be both disciples and loving friends. That level of kind of intimacy and intensity in friendship is something that's very rare to find nowadays, even within the church. My favorite example of contemporary mistrust of physicality in love outside marriage is from Bible translation. A friend of mine found this thing where in the New Testament we hear that the beloved disciple John reclined on the breast of Jesus to listen to Jesus' words as an especially intimate friend of Jesus and especially close disciple. You can find a Bible translation where John is actually resting near Jesus, like a safe distance away from Jesus. So one of the big questions for me then, as I was trying to sort of like renew and rediscover these forgotten forms of love, was how do you love people with your body in a culture that strongly associates physical contact and physical affection with sex? And that's been where I've, and I still don't know that I have a super great answer for that. I think that's still kind of something that I'm working out and that other people who are trying to live non-marital vocations are still working out. But definitely the kind of one place where it's really easy to see and to understand is in acts of service. When you're like caring for someone's child, right? When you're sort of holding their child or changing their child or cleaning, if someone is in need and you're cleaning their body, right? Jesus himself washes feet, I think partly for this reason, to show you that the physical act of service is an act of love. Jesus himself, right, is God and therefore is love, and yet does not have sex, so there must be other ways to love and other ways to express love with the body. And one of the ways that Jesus is, and the two ways, I guess, that Jesus is most insistent on are sacrifice to the point of death and service. With the washing of the feet of the disciples being probably the most obvious model for us to follow there. So I think that's when I'm at the Pregnancy Center. Well, so part of the reason that I wanted to do pregnancy counseling was that I wanted some way of loving and serving women. There's just, it's hard to put into words, right? A lot of the 70s lesbian feminists sort of waffle around with phrases like women's energy and women's community. And the thing is, like, they're getting at a real thing. That there is some real kind of solidarity and community that is sort of all women. And I really longed for that and longed to be around that and wanted to make it make that women's community a site where I was giving and receiving love. And the Pregnancy Center, I looked into a few different options. The Pregnancy Center was the one that had the longest training, and since I didn't know what I was doing, I figured that would be a better one. And it really puts you in touch with both the humiliations that the body kind of inflicts on us and also the ways that by being gentle and humble with one another, we can honor people who are suffering, people who are going through a lot. When you're talking to someone who is not sure, who desperately wants her pregnancy test to be negative, and as she's got her like little cup of urine here, and she's sort of putting with the dropper, and her hand is shaking. The body is speaking its vulnerability in such an intense, unmistakable form. And to be able to create an atmosphere where she can do all of this, she can let all of that fear out in an atmosphere where it will be met with love and not with judgment, is, I think, like one of the greatest gifts that I've been allowed to kind of, it's not even really giving, it's like to be in the presence of. And then two, to see how much the women that we see at the pregnancy center sacrifice in order to do the right thing, whatever they perceive that to be. It's not always what I think is the right thing, but to see that every path in life requires so much intense personal sacrifice from people, often expressed again through the vulnerability and helplessness of the body. Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not doing well at sort of structuring all
really...
of this. But it's a place where because you're encountering people in a moment when their bodies have often kind of not brought them what they hoped. And yet you're able to say, no, there's honor in what you're going through, there is beauty in what you're going through. This is a place where God is actually blessing you, and because most of our clients are Christian, so I would not use this language if they weren't, but with clients who do see and understand and agree with that, it becomes a real space where we can kind of come together on common ground as both women and Christians to say, no, our bodies are not really under our control as much as we would like. Our lives are not under our control. And yet it's precisely in those moments when our own plans are most destroyed and we are most humiliated that we can come together and love one another more deeply.
Yeah, so it strikes me as you talk, right, that what you're describing, this vulnerability, this fragility of the flesh, this debasement, this being brought to a point of utter humiliation, that this sounds like the Passion. Right? That this is not, that what you're describing is familiar. Especially familiar in the way that Christ demonstrates his love for us. And it strikes me as fascinating that this starts out for you not from an intellectual decision to follow the Passion, right? But out of a desire to love women, right? Which is precisely the desire that traditionally Christians would have understood as the confused desire, right? But because and the way that the church traditionally, or Christians traditionally thought of homosexuality was always considered an aberration. But this aberration, precisely this aberration, has brought you to the same place in understanding the body as the witness of Christ does in his Passion. Can you talk a little bit about that, about the experience of your desire, and how that has helped you to understand more concretely the experience of Christian life?
Maybe. I do think one thing that I think is that a lot of pretty much all of the deepest spiritual experiences in my life, the ones where it's been in retrospect most clear that they were necessary and good for me, have been things that I didn't choose and wouldn't have chosen. Being gay is actually probably not necessarily even on that list. That was out of my control, and in that sense was humbling. But because I was raised in a very progressive environment, it was not true. I did not have a lot of the intense fear or shame around it that a lot of people, unfortunately, growing up in the church have. But I guess it is one example of finding that your life is not what you or your parents had intended it to be, and that you're going to have to sort of accommodate. And put it this way, that we often talk about discerning vocations, and it can kind of make it sound like you, the autonomous individual choosing, are going to go out and like
figure out which vocation you're most drawn to, and that's the one that God is going to give you. When it actually seems like the vast majority of people end up accepting their vocations, that most of our life is about accepting the circumstances that constrain us. And either, if it's actual injustice, trying to find some way to fight against it, or most of the time, right, it's just how life is. And you just have to find some way of understanding it as an opportunity for humility, as a blessing in its own way, as opposed to this is something I did not choose, do not control, and didn't want, it must be bad. There's a pretty strong Christian tradition of saying, well, if you didn't choose it, you don't control it, and you didn't want it, maybe that's what's good about it. And like that's always resonated with me pretty strongly. I hesitate to, I don't really know if that was totally what you were getting at. I think one thing that the Passion ideally can help us see is that the experience of pain and public humiliation and the experience of injustice, right, do not have to be shameful. You don't have to add additional kind of like judgment of yourself for experiencing them. This is something that comes up a ton at the Pregnancy Center because we see a lot of women who everyone around them wants them to, if they are pregnant, to have an abortion. That their mom would prefer that. Their friends tell them this is the only smart thing to do. And there's a lot of moral pressure. It's sort of a no-win situation, right? Because you're not supposed to be pregnant you're not supposed to be pregnant too young or out of wedlock. You're not supposed to be not having sex because that's crazy. And you're not supposed to have an abortion. So there's sort of no way to win. And so we see women who are precisely because they are now facing this kind of vulnerability, put additional judgment and shame on themselves that they are, even when they're like doing the right thing, that too is going to be judged and condemned by a lot of people around them rather than honored and supported. So where was I going? Oh, right. So the Passion. So the Passion is sort of like the quintessential example of someone who's being held up as a criminal and subjected to a violent death as a result of that. And yet, that the pain in itself and the suffering and even the public humiliation and being outcast from the community in and of themselves are not kind of like, what's the word I'm looking for? Not proof that he's done something wrong. Whereas I think a lot of the time, maybe this is an American thing, we think that if we are suffering intensely, it's because we've done something wrong. That's often false. It's often either because we've done something right, or it's just kind of how the world is. Yeah. Well, and I'll say that, and part of where that goes with being gay is that if you are in a minority of any kind, right, there is going to be some suffering that goes along with that, and especially if you're in a minority whose situation has become in the church like politically inflamed, right, like just utterly painful to the touch, where everybody has an opinion on what you should be doing with your life, that in many of which are expressed in pretty harsh terms, that experience in itself, I think, is part of what convinces a lot of young gay people that they've done something wrong, that there's something wrong with them, when in fact I think it may be better understood as part of their experience of the cross, of being cast out by their community and being exposed to public misunderstanding at best, but the fact that they are experiencing that suffering does not mean that they've actually done anything, let alone anything wrong. People often feel intensely humiliated for, I feel some of this, for following church teaching. That in itself is experienced as a very embarrassing thing to do with your life. And ideally, we would be able to see that mindset that suffering always indicates a moral problem on the part of the sufferer is like deeply anti-Christian.
And so I have just one more question before I want to open it up to everyone else, but because of what you said there at the end, one of the things that to me always characterizes a real, authentic experience of the church's teachings is that it makes me feel more free, right? Not encumbered, not. So I guess my question is that true for you in this experience of following the church's teachings and being a very public witness in that?
I mean, no, right? But let me just say, like, so I think part of what I think is going on here is that different people respond to different ways of looking at how God is working in their lives. I always, like, since I was a little child, have been more attuned to language of duty and obedience. And in fact, part of what was so attractive to me in the church, I think, was that it was one of